Fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Stephen Poyner, and I have the privilege of being the resource teacher at the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida. At the center, our mission is to use the history and the lessons of the Holocaust to build a just and caring community free of anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice and bigotry. On this day, we come together to remember one of the most heinous crimes of our time, the systematic killing of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and millions of others by the Nazis and their collaborators in the Holocaust. On January 27, 1945, the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp and death camp was liberated by Soviet forces. Since 2005, the United Nations designated this day to officially be recognized as the International Day of Commemoration and Memory of the Victims of the Holocaust. The liberation of the death camps ended the carnage, but horrified the world as the scope of the Nazis' crimes became clear. And out of this horror, the United Nations was created to bring countries together for peace and our common humanity, as well as to prevent any repetition of such crimes against humanity. With the resurgence of hatred in recent years and in recent days, from violent extremism to attacks on places of worship, and with the most recent attack just days ago, where extremist movements demonstrated the hate with a clear show of words, symbols, and actions by attacking our nation's capital and our democracy. This shows that anti-Semitism and other forms of religious bigotry, racism, and prejudice are still very much with us. Neo-Nazis and white supremacists are resurgent, as are their continued efforts to diminish the Holocaust and deny or downplay the responsibilities of perpetrators. But just as hate persists, so must our resolve to fight it. Our work is truly, now more than ever, relevant. Today and every day, we commemorate the victims of the Holocaust by pursuing truth, remembrance, education, and by building peace and justice around the world. We pledge that we will never forget. We vow to tell the stories. We promise to honor the victims of the Holocaust by defending everyone's right to live with dignity in a just and peaceful world. Just a brief overview of our program today. We hope that you'll be inspired by today's program, where we'll pay tribute to the millions of lives lost through a candle lighting and a commemorative reading, which will be led by local students. We will also hear the powerful story of Ralph Preiss, who will be introduced by his cousin and executive director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Orlando, Keith Devorcic. We will hear how the Philippines became a place of refuge for over 1,200 Jews fleeing the Nazis, as you may have seen in the inspirational film Rescue in the Philippines, which the Holocaust Center is proudly presenting. And if you've not had a chance to experience this incredible film, you're able to register to watch it for 2 more days on our website under Programs and Events. Then we'll have a Q&A session that will be led by Rachel Lucy Hitt, who serves as the Director of Education at the Center, concluding the event with Rabbi David Kay with the reciting of the Mourner's Kaddish. So our next item is we will be having the commemorative reading. We will now begin the commemorative reading and the candle lighting ceremony, wherein students from our community will read aloud the names of the concentration camps, their dates of liberation, and powerful reflections from survivors, liberators, and other eyewitnesses. 6 candles will be lit in honor of the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust, among them 1.5 million children, as well as in honor of all the victims, survivors, and eyewitnesses to such horrors. Now we'll begin the ceremony. It's my honor to introduce our 6 student leaders who will read for us: Haley Parati, Adrian Delgado, Sydney Coster, Maureen Earle, Leanne Lemon, and Reagan Tobiansen. Adrian, if you will please start us off. I'm sorry, I apologize. Haley, if you'll please start us off.
Ravensbrück was liberated on April 29th, 1945 by the USSR. Vigilance is our absolute duty. Evil can return at any time, and we are not allowed to forget what happened here. This was stated by Annette Chaloux, a Ravensbrück survivor, from remarks given at 70th anniversary commemoration of the liberation of Ravensbrück. I will now pass it to Adrian.
Dachau, liberated on April 29th, 1945 by the USA. A quote from Lieutenant Colonel Phoenix Sparks. Most certainly, there were well over 100,000 Allied soldiers who were eyewitnesses to the unspeakable horror of the Holocaust, along with a considerable number of Holocaust survivors. To those sick people in our society who say that it never happened, I say, tell us who were there that it never happened. A Dachau Liberator, speech excerpts from May 18th, 1995 at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. I would now like to hand this over.
Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was liberated on January 27th, 1945 by the USSR. It was hard to look at them. I saw the joy in their eyes. They realized that they were free. From their gaze, we could feel their gratitude to us. Ivan Martinushkin, he was a Soviet liberator, from recollections on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I will now pass it to Maureen.
Bergen-Belsen, liberated on April 15th, 1945 by Great Britain. One thing that I remember vividly was after entering the camp, you'd see the inmates, which weren't too bad. They got worse as they went down the camp. And as I stood there, this, I don't know if it was a man or a woman, you couldn't tell really, came up to me and kissed my boots, and it nearly brought tears to my eyes. It was very emotional. Gilbert King, British Liberator, interview from Imperial War Museum, June 2008. I will now pass over to Leanne.
Ordruff, liberated on April 4th, 1945 by the USA. The things I saw beggared description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand experience of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Letter to General George C. Marshall, April 15, 1945. I now turn it over to Reagan.
Sachsenhausen, liberated on April 22, 1945 by Polish forces under Soviet command. The machine gun on the gate overlooking the plaza and camp was empty for the first time. The Germans had left. Nothing happened for a while, except we realized that maybe we were going to live. Eventually, the gates swung open and Russian troops came in, and they began ringing the camp bell to say that we were free. Thomas Bergenthal, Sachsenhausen survivor. Interview excerpts on January 29, 1990 from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
I'd like to offer our warmest gratitude to all these wonderful students for taking the time to read for us today. Thank you so much for being here and for taking this time. Now, I'm most grateful to introduce you to Keith Devorcic. Born in Gainesville, Florida, and growing up in both Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Keith received a BS in accounting and a master's of education and counseling from the Pennsylvania State University before returning to Florida, where he ran the Hillel at the University of Florida for 15 years before going to Seattle, Washington, to head the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle in 2013. In October 2016, he took over as the CEO at the Roth Jewish Community Center of Orlando. And in 2018, he also became the executive director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Orlando. Keith, thank you for being with us today. I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you everybody who is joining us today. It really is my honor and privilege to be able to introduce my cousin, Ralph Preiss. My family generations are kind of mixed up, so while Ralph's my cousin, I've always thought of him as my uncle. And growing up, I've heard bits and pieces of his story, and it was always intriguing. I never understood why Jews were in the Philippines. I'd never heard about the story until I began hearing Ralph's, And every time I hear him talk about his story, I learn something new, and there's something incredible with it. And it really is such an honor and a privilege to share Ralph and his daughter Jacqueline with you today to talk about his story and something that we all will learn amazing things about. So now I'd like to turn it over to Ralph and Jackie.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to share my story with you all during this sacred time of remembrance. And a special thank you to my cousin Keith Devorcic for all the important work he does with the Jewish Federation of Greater Orlando. I'm so proud of him. I'm talking to you from my kitchen in Poughkeepsie, New York. My wife Marcia is in the other room listening in. It's amazing that in this scary time of isolation, we can all reach out and be together. In my lifetime, I've seen extraordinary technological advances in computing and the way we can come together on Zoom from all over. Still, it feels like a little bit of a miracle, especially when I can get it to work. I must say that my computer was hacked last night, and I'm now using a phone instead. I was born in Germany before Hitler came to power. As a Jew, I would not be here today to tell you this story if it were not for the humanity, political courage, and generosity of the open door policy of Philippine President Quezon. And I'm always grateful for the opportunity to tell this important story as a witness so that his legacy is not forgotten. In 1926, my father, Dr. Harry Preiss, a veteran of World War I, a former private in the German Medical Corps, was assigned by the German Civil Service to work in a small farming town, Rosenberg, Oberschlesien, in what was then southeastern Germany. He worked in the office of Dr. Adolf Süßbach, a retired army doctor who had risen to the rank of general in charge of hospitals on the Eastern Front during the Great War. As you can imagine, both families considered themselves German first and foremost, and only Jewish by religion. There, Harry met and fell in love with Süßbach's beautiful daughter, Margaret, and my parents were married the following year. I was born in 1930. Here I am with my baby nurse. The Rosenberg Synagogue is in the background. My parents and I lived with my grandparents above their medical office, which was just across the street. My early years were idyllic, but beginning in 1934, with Hitler's rise to power, all Jewish members of the civil service lost their jobs. My mother's brother, Egon, was a surgeon in Berlin, and he and his wife almost immediately immigrated to Shanghai, which at the time was an open port city, so anyone could find refuge there. Also in early 1934, my grandfather passed away, and we moved into a two-family house, one of 5 that my father had built at the edge of town as an investment. My maternal grandmother, Omi Süßbach, lived on the left and we on the right. So you can see my grandmother and my mother in the upper windows there of that house. A glassed-in porch connected the two halves in the back of the house so we could visit each other without going outside. My mother's sister, Erna, was married to a lawyer, also practicing in Berlin. He too had been fired. He emigrated to Paris to practice law. While he studied for the French bar, my aunt and cousins Frank, Arthur, and Ernst Olaf came to live with us for a year. The boys shared a room with me, and as an only child, this year of having two cousins to play with was a highlight of my young life. After my aunt and cousins left for Paris, Omi Zusbach took care of me, and we were very close. Even though he was Jewish, my father didn't immediately lose his job because there were not enough Aryan doctors to serve the public needs in Rosenberg. So he ignored my uncle's recommendation to leave Germany as well. In 1936, I started public school and proudly saluted my Führer every morning. I remember clearly my shock when one day my teacher called me out in class to say I was no longer allowed to salute the picture of Adolf Hitler, since he is not the Führer of Jews. Shortly after that, the other Jewish children in town and I could no longer go to school with Aryan children. We had to take a train daily to attend a Jewish school 21 kilometers away. On returning home from school, I was often attacked by older boys who chased me, threw stones, and called me dirty Jew. You can imagine how fast I learned to run fast. Finally, at the end of 1937, my father lost his job when an Aryan doctor moved into town. My father converted our back porch into his office where he would treat Jewish patients. And though it was against the law to treat Aryan patients, I remember local farmers who my father had been treating for years and who trusted him would leave game or produce as payment for his care in secret. No longer able to support his family, my father desperately searched for ways to leave Germany, finally answering an ad in a Jewish paper stating that the Philippines was looking for physicians. Of 400 applicants, we later learned my father was one of 20 lucky ones to be accepted that summer. A little background on the extraordinary story that led to that fateful advertisement my father answered. In 1935, the Philippines had become a commonwealth under President Manuel L. Quezon. He's one of the heroes of the story, along with the 5 Frieder brothers of Cincinnati, who ran their 2 for a dime cigar business out of the Philippines, rotating 2-year assignments abroad. Before 1937, there had been a small Jewish community of about 150 families in the Philippines. But then Jewish refugees fleeing from the fighting in Shanghai began to arrive in Manila. Alerted to the plight of Jews in Germany and Austria, the Frieders decided to take action. Over games of poker played on the veranda of the Frieder home with President Quezon, Paul McNutt, the US High Commissioner, and Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower, an aide to General MacArthur, they hatched out a plot to earmark 10,000 visas to the Philippines for German and Austrian Jewish professionals and farmers. I would say President Kazan was impressed with the kibbutz system in Palestine, where the Jews had made the desert bloom. Those of you who've seen the film Rescue in the Philippines, another part of this memorial commemoration, will be quite aware of that part of history. The Philippine Jewish community, of which a Frieder usually was the head, had to guarantee that it would support the refugees coming to Manila. So with the help of the other brothers in Cincinnati, the Joint Distribution Committee in the US was engaged to raise funds to guarantee the visas. We had never heard of the Philippines, so we looked it up in our encyclopedia, and we read that this country in the South Pacific was a Spanish colony since the late 1500s, and Spanish was the common language. So while we waited for our visas, my father knew exactly what to do: study up on tropical diseases and enroll the family in Spanish lessons. My mother also took a class in corsetry, since we were advised that she would need to support the family while my father was preparing for his medical exam to get his license when we get to Manila, the Philippine capital. The visas to the Philippines were to be issued by the United States Consulate in Breslau, the nearest big city. So my father assumed that Spain didn't have a consulate there. That's why we had to come to the United States consulate. Thus, in the morning of November 9, 1938, my parents drove to Breslau to hound the American consulate for our visas and to spend the night with my father's Uncle Alfred and Aunt Lena and other Lindner cousins. This left my grandmother and me at home alone on what was later to be known as Kristallnacht. I remember clearly being awakened in the middle of the night to the sound of the shutters of our house being ripped from their hinges and the breaking of windows on our ground floor. Omi and I hid together, shaking with fright in our attic air raid shelter. Then, after a long time of terror, we heard gunshots and shouting, the running of feet, the slamming of car doors, and the screeching of wheels. Our friendly Aryan neighbor, Teacher Lunger, the father of my longtime friend Günther, now a Hitlerjugend member, had scared away the hooligans who were attacking our house by firing warning shots into the air. The hooligans weren't locals, we were later assured by neighbors, but hired hands from neighboring towns. Teacher Lunger also helped Omi clean up the glass and hung sheets over the broken windows. That night, they also burned our beautiful synagogue. I was able to see the flames from my bedroom window, and I suffered from terrible nightmares of that fire for a long time afterwards. Later that night, the Gestapo came to our house, not to assess damage, but to arrest my father. Omi was able to tell them the doctor was not at home. It was expected, however, that he turn himself in on his return, and they left. Back in Breslau, Uncle Alfred and Cousin Hans were arrested by the Gestapo and sent to a concentration camp. Upstairs in the house at the time of their arrest, my father overheard the conversation and, as an obedient German, wanted to surrender himself, but my mother kept him from it. Thus, my father stayed in hiding in Breslau until our visas to the Philippines and freedom finally arrived in January of 1939. We later learned that the visa delay was caused through interference by the US State Department. We were forced to sell our real estate holdings to Nazis at their price. And even though we were not permitted to take more than 100 Reichsmarks per person with us, we were allowed to take a lift with our belongings. So my father, refusing to leave money for the Nazis, bought medical equipment to outfit a small hospital. We also had tropical furniture specially built for us. There were all sizes of tropical clothes and shoes for growing me. We also took a Torah scroll that had been saved by a friendly farmer and given to us when our synagogue had burnt down during Kristallnacht. My mother had to make all of these final arrangements herself, and I remember Gestapo officers would come to the house to check that we weren't packing anything that was not allowed. On the way to Manila, we first stopped in Paris to say goodbye to my cousins, which at the time we didn't know would be our final farewell. It was not until the 1970s that we learned of their fate from Nazi documents unearthed by Beate and Serge Klarsfeld, chronicling the shameful roundup of Jews in Paris by the French police in the summer of 1942. The entire family was detained and then deported to Auschwitz on 3 separate trains, for which they had to buy tickets from the French railroad. My uncle was deported on 1 train. My aunt with Frank Arthur was a week later, and 12-year-old Ernst Olaf all by himself 3 weeks after that. On arrival, they were all murdered. Picture of my cousins is on display in the barracks at Auschwitz, has been converted to a memorial to the murdered Jews of France, with 1 room devoted to the French children who perished there. This is a picture of a birthday party my cousins and I attended back in Germany with my good friend Kate Karminski and her older brother Rudy. The Karminskis were trapped in Germany when the war started. Deported to Auschwitz, Kate and her mother were murdered upon arrival. Rudy's father didn't survive the camps, but Rudy did, living by his wits and building V-1 rockets as a slave laborer for Bernhard von Braun. We found each other again in London in 1974 and were as close as brothers until his death in 2008. Excuse me, I'm tearing. My mother's mother, Omi Zusbach, was able to join my uncle in Shanghai and survived the war, but died shortly after. Her grave was destroyed during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. My father's mother, Omi Preiss, on the left, stayed behind in Germany in an old age home and died in a cattle car being transported to Theresienstadt as part of Hitler's final solution. If not for our visas to the Philippines, it is more than likely that my fate and that of my parents would have been similar to those we left behind. After leaving Paris, we took a train to Genoa, where we were to board the German liner SS Potsdam for Manila. I remember the train ride going through the Alps, through longer and longer tunnels on the way to Italy. Then we were stopped at the border and had to show our German passports. Ours had large red J stamped over the swastikas. This made the border guard look for an entry visa to Italy, which German citizens did not need. He made us get off the train, and we were detained till we were sent back to France on the next train. Again, rolling through the long tunnels, the train stopped at the French border. There, the French border guards checked our passports and found that our French visas had expired. So they took us off the train and sent us back to Italy through the tunnels on the next train. This back and forth trip repeated several times, till my father, in desperation that we might miss our ship sailing, spent all the money he had, 300 Reichsmarks, to bribe someone from the German steamship company to get guards to accompany us through the Italian border to reach the pier in Genoa and our ship, of course. Talking with people on board, my parents found out that English was spoken in the Philippines. The encyclopedia that my father had owned and consulted was printed in 1898, the year that the Philippines were ceded to the United States by Spain after the Spanish-American War. My father knew little English from his studies, but my mother and I had to start from scratch. We arrived in Manila in March 1939, and I remember being greeted at the pier by an imposing man in a white sharkskin suit. We later learned that this was Alex Frieder, who had headed the selection committee to recommend Jewish refugees to President Quezon to come to the Philippines. We were settled in a boarding house by the Jewish committee, and when our lift arrived, we moved into a house a block away from Temple Emil, the center of Jewish life in Manila. My father's medical equipment was promptly used to furnish the newly built Mercy Hospital, where he found work as an X-ray technician while preparing for his medical exam. Manila was beautiful. I could roam the streets freely on wide sidewalks, but at first I could only play with German-speaking kids. I had to learn English, which the Jewish committee provided in our temple's Bachar Hall for kids of all ages. There I made a lot of lifetime friends, and soon enough I was making friends with the local kids in my neighborhood. You can see me there circled in red. I repeated second grade, this time in English, at the La Salle College, a Christian Brothers K through 12 plus 4-year college institution, less than a mile from our house. Although being a physician was our ticket out of Germany, my father was not allowed to practice as a doctor in the Philippines. because a law was enacted at the request of the Medical Association lobby that only Filipinos or American citizens could practice medicine. But my father was able to engage in a number of different professional pursuits using his background in chemistry and a lot of ingenuity. First, he started a small manufacturing company producing lotions called Preiss, which were sold door to door by other Jewish refugees. In the fall of 1940, he took a job as medical supervisor at an American soft drink factory in Lillo, Laguna, about 2 hours southeast of Manila. There he improved the recipe of an orange soda drink by adding vitamin C and bottled and brown beer bottles to protect the potency of the vitamin. He called it Tone Up and sold it to the US Navy for use in submarines to help to prevent scurvy. I stayed in Manila to continue my schooling at La Salle, boarding with my parents' good friends, the Castles. In April 1940, my mother and I were privileged to attend a ceremony at which President Quezon turned over his own Marikina estate to the Jewish community for the refugees to establish a model kibbutz, like in Israel. Mr. Frieder is sitting on the left. President Quezon is standing at the microphone. My ambition that day as an 8-year-old was to get the president's autograph. But as I approached the table after the speech, the men started walking away. What should I do? I guess my mother suggested I stop them. These are frames taken from the Frieder film documentary Rescue in the Philippines and shows me there with my mother. First time I saw it. This picture of me receiving President Quezon's autograph appeared in Manila papers together with his speech in Marikina. In his speech that day, President Quezon said, "It is my hope and indeed my expectation that the people of the Philippines will have in the future every reason to be glad when the time of need came. This country was glad to extend to persecuted people a hand of welcome." Life changed suddenly on Sunday, December 7, 1941. News came that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor and war was expected in the Far East. My parents were scheduled to come to Manila from Lillo the next day to take me to the hospital to have my tonsils removed. But we were awakened in the middle of the night by the house shaking. Arid sirens were wailing. We thought it was an earthquake. So in our pajamas, Mr. Castle moved us all to the street to join our neighbors. It was cold. I was trembling. I've never been as scared in my life. In the sky were bursts of anti-aircraft fire, flares, and the sound of exploding bombs. Our house was located just 3 miles from the airport, which was the target being bombed. So we heard the planes screeching in the sky, seeing them only when ripping through the lights from the flares, searchlights, or bomb blasts. This lasted the longest time until the all clear sirens wailed, and we could go back to bed. In the morning, my parents called and told me, to my relief, that my tonsils operation had been canceled. I still have my tonsils right now. That day, school was also closed, and my parents took me back to Lilio and safety during the Japanese invasion. My parents were once again lucky in that by presenting their expired German passports with a large red J stamped in it, they were considered allies of the Japanese, and so were not subject to the brutal internment that Americans and other enemy aliens were subjected to during the cruel Japanese occupation. Since the bridges to Lilio were blown, we were cut off from communication. So my parents moved to São Pablo City, a little closer to Manila. There, my father established a soft drink factory with a Filipino partner from Lilio, Mr. Fernandez, and through the war, using local products, bottled a new vitamin C drink by Vitona. He invented a new way to recycle crown caps using rubber stamped from discarded tire inner tubes instead of cork, and kept the drinks with old recycled crown caps. I enjoyed working for my father, pushing a cart to find recyclables, making bottle caps, and checking sealed bottles for sediments or ants. In the evening, I studied with my father from his German medical texts and novels, German novels, to keep up my education. By 1943, I was back in Manila living with Cantor Cisner and his mother while preparing to become a bar mitzvah. Once again, I attended La Salle, where the curriculum had changed to Japanese language. Japanese propaganda promoted the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. I remember in May 1943, the Japanese declared Philippine independence. Premier Tojo actually came to Manila to inaugurate puppet President Jose Laurel. Since his son Junior attended my class at La Salle, our class was chosen to welcome the premier by waving Japanese and Philippine flags. During the ceremony, Tojo reviewed those in attendance and stopped in front of me, demanding to know in Japanese who this tall white boy was standing among all those Filipinos. Brother Adolf, our Japanese language teacher who led the attending class, explained I was a good German boy. Premier Chojo smiled and moved on. 5 months later, I became a bar mitzvah at Temple Emil, reading from the Torah we bought from Rosenberg. Then my parents took me back to São Pablo with them, enrolling me in the local school where I learned carpentry, farming, and animal husbandry, and helping my father in the soft drink factory. By the end of 1944, General MacArthur made good on his promise and returned to the Philippines. The bombing began again. Every morning, a P-38 flew over our house looking for troop movements to bomb or strafe. I found this fascinating and would often stand outside in full view to watch. Crazy kid. But at that time, the small Japanese garrison in São Pablo had left us alone. But a new Japanese commander who spoke perfect German came around often and borrowed German books from my father's library. This commander also played poker with another local German Jew, and once again, a game of poker played a crucial role in my family's fate. Late December 1944, over cards and drinks, the Japanese commander warned that he had orders to take the lives of 10 white people for every Japanese that was killed. From this, along with leaflets dropped by the Americans urging civilians to evacuate São Paulo, they realized it was time to make preparations to flee. My father had already buried our valuables under the house, and he had dismantled his factory equipment and hid it in a nearby plantation. But our final preparations were sudden, and we had to leave our beloved dog Boogie, a pit bull who did not get along with strangers. He was tied to the front post of the house with a bowl of food laced with poison, so he wouldn't suffer during the fighting. Our party of 20 left in the middle of the night in the final days of 1944, finding refuge on the slopes of Mount Banahao, creating a community of about 70 composed of 11 Europeans, the rest Filipinos, and their families, of which 10 were gun-toting guerrillas. We also had about 20 horses. We were well organized, moving camp every week. My mother was part of the kitchen crew. My father was a member of the planning staff and also the camp doctor. I joined the scouting and lean-to building crews, learning to use a sharp bolo, a 2.5-foot long sword that could cut through a coconut in one slice, and chop clearings through the jungle and the woods. Hiding in the jungle, we could observe the fighting below and the dog fights above. By early April, the fighting came closer to us as most of the Japanese force retreated to the base of Mount Banahao. Our group was now caught behind Japanese lines. We knew we had to sneak past the encroaching Japanese to reach the Americans. We descended the mountain in 2 groups, my parents in one group on foot, and I helped with the horses in the other. My parents made it through first and anxiously awaited my group, which was held up by an approaching Japanese force. The next day, we tried again, but ran into a band of troops wearing what looked like Japanese helmets. Just before making a fast turnaround, I heard soldiers talking in English. They were Americans equipped with a new novel, the new bowl-shaped helmets. We were liberated. During the fighting, most of São Paulo had been destroyed. Our house was completely gone, but to our great surprise, upon our return, after 4 months, Boogie was free of his collar and chain, greeted us among the ruins of our house, emaciated and with a 50 caliber bullet stuck in his leg. Boogie and his bullet went on to live a long and happy life with his reunited family. How he got freed and how he survived the fighting, we never learned. Temple Emil was the only synagogue on American soil to be destroyed during World War II. Japanese had used it to store ammunition and blew it up together with the Rosenberg Torah, so as they retreated from Manila. American servicemen helped rebuild it after the war. The month-long battle for Manila had been brutal, with fighting street to street. Some 80 of the Jewish refugees, as well as other civilians, were caught in the crossfire. All of the brothers at La Salle were massacred. I saw the plaque of the school at the school when I returned for a reunion in 2015. Adolphe Gebhardt was my Japanese teacher, and Baptiste de La Salle was my favorite third grade teacher. I finished high school in 3 years in Sao Paulo after the war, and then began studying engineering at the University of the Philippines. After a twister destroyed the engineering Quonset hut in 1949, I traveled to the USA to earn my BSEE engineering degree at MIT. I'd intended to return to the Philippines to work for the Manila Electric Company, but I got hooked by a new technology, computers. So after completing my master's degree at the University of Connecticut, where my MIT professor had taken me as his graduate assistant, and where I also met my future wife, Marcia, I got my one and only dream job at IBM, designing, testing, and diagnosing computers. I thus remained in the United States and became a naturalized citizen. Meanwhile, my parents once again had to rebuild their lives. In 1949, they moved to Manila, where my father worked for Estrella del Norte and eventually established a drug-producing laboratory factory called Estraco. In the 1950s, my father introduced warfarin to the Philippines and helped save the sugar crop from an overwhelming infestation of rats. I know my father was grateful to be able to do something for his adopted country that had saved his family. When he retired in 1968, my parents joined my family in the USA, where I was working for IBM, building large room-sized computers. My wife and I have four daughters, 10 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. We're all beholden to President Quezon for his vision and humanity. The Open Doors Monument stands in a park in Rishon LeZion, Israel, dedicated to President Quezon, and engraved with the words, "I witnessed him speaking at his Marikina estate 81 years ago." This picture shows me with my Israeli grandson, Yonatan, during the dedication ceremony in 2009. My wife often reminds me that I was once asked about my feelings for the Philippines, and I replied that even though I love the United States, which has given my family and me so much, I'll always think of the Philippines as home. Thank you, President Quezon, for saving thousands of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. I really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us. And as you were speaking, actually, there were lots of people in the chat room sharing their thoughts, thanking you for speaking, and actually asking some questions. So I wonder if you would mind answering a few of them?
I certainly would. Please
Wonderful.
do read some.
Of course, of course. Charlotte Miller actually asks, when was the first time that you shared your story? She says, I know many people shared very little with family and descendants, etc. So when was the first time that you shared your story?
Actually, my daughter, who's been helping run the slides today, Jackie, was, I think, the first one who asked me for my story when she had to write an essay for school, I think grade 6 or something like that. And I guess that's the first time I may have shared it. I never spoke about it before. And later on, I did speak about it here in different places in Poughkeepsie and the region all around, like Hyde Park and Wappingers Falls and so on, when I was invited to speak on occasions.
Yes, actually, another viewer, Fred and Francis Brown, are asking how often you do speaking engagements like this. They say this is an excellent presentation that has such humanity. And I know you've told me that you've spoken a number of times, both in person as well as over this past year virtually, and also that you shared this, I believe, for your 90th birthday with your family and friends on a large Zoom call. Is that right?
Yes, we had over 100 people for my birthday celebration, which my 4 daughters organized, and they were not all in the United States. They were all over the world, actually, that listened in. Yeah, last year on January 27, I spoke at the UN, actually. Gave a similar talk to this. Whenever I got invited, I did speak, period. I spoke in Israel a number of times to my grandchildren's schools. And let's see, yeah, even my grandchildren here in the United States, I spoke in their schools. So I've spoken in different towns around.
Well, I would agree with Lynn Geary, who says, what a privilege it has been to hear about your life. And I absolutely agree with that statement as well.
Thank you.
Some of the other questions that are coming in, though, are actually some similar ones that when I first heard you speak, I had as well. You have so many beautiful and amazing photos that your daughter Jacqueline was able to show us as you were speaking. How is it that you have all these photos?
My family emigrated to all over the world. They were in South America, they were in Israel, they were in America. And so my parents always sent them pictures. So also my Shanghai relatives. So they each had albums of our family, and they sent those pictures back to us. So that's how I got the pictures. Some of them are in pretty bad shape, but others are fine. The pictures from my cousins in Paris. It turns out that my cousin's apartment in Paris was kept completely till after the war. We don't know why. I guess nobody mentioned to the police or the Germans that this is Jewish property. And so after the war, friends of my parents went who went to Paris did look up the place and got in and sent us a whole album that they found there. So that's where I got those pictures, and I passed them on to the Klarsfelds.
It's wonderful. It sounds like you really were able to put together all these photos from around the world from other people, as well as I think you also mentioned some of the screenshots that were on there were from the film Rescue in the Philippines, right? Some of the ones that you hadn't seen before.
Yeah, that when they were shooting the film, I suddenly realized that's me there.
Another question going along with how you were able to have all of these photos, but also Rabbi Kay is asking how the Torah was able to be smuggled out.
Okay. Originally, I always was sure that they were smuggled, that the Torah was smuggled out of Germany by my mother. It turned out I read in a book written by a Columbia professor who researched this particular part, and he found that we did get permission to actually take the Torah along, which really surprised me. So it's a book about Breslau itself, written by Columbia professor Asher.
Wonderful, thank you. Something that you talked about too, and I found this very interesting, that I think your family was trying to do its due diligence and research about the Philippines and learn about the country and the language and do as much as you can to learn the language, which you thought was Spanish.
Yes,
prior to coming to the Philippines, right? Only to realize that it was an old encyclopedia and you hadn't gotten the most up-to-date information.
Let me just say that the Spanish did help my mother, especially because she was doing corsetry. And who was using corsets in the Philippines? Only high society. And they spoke Spanish. So this worked out perfectly.
Wonderful. Yes, there's lots of Spanish words that are still mixed in with Tagalog and English, right? That's spoken there. But who is it? Let's see. I think it was Ziva Gottsman is asking about languages and how many languages you speak, and how long it took you to learn Tagalog, if you did, once you moved to the Philippines.
Well, okay. Let me only admit to speaking German, English, and English. I did have to learn Japanese. I did learn Spanish, but not having spoken all those languages. Hebrew too, by the way. Yeah, Hebrew I learned, and my teacher in Hebrew, whom I met in Israel, was very disappointed that I didn't know a word anymore, and still I was a bright student of his. He remembered me. So I've learned many languages, including Russian in school, but I don't really speak them.
You can claim them. You can get by a little bit in some of them, right?
Yeah, well, I can at least read my way around on maps in the different languages.
Wonderful. We have a message and question from Claire, pardon my pronunciation, Heinrichs Gatos. And They say, thank you so much for your presentation. When did you realize as a child that what happened to your family was related to being Jewish?
You know, I was a well-protected child, and until I was told by my teacher that I can't salute the Führer anymore, I hated Joe Louis when he knocked out, I think Max Baer or so, the German champion during the Olympics, 1936 Olympics. I still remember that, but I was definitely a German through and through before that. And I was not aware of any difference between Jews and Germans. In fact, the people in Rosenberg were all friendly to us. That's why they apologized that our house was broken in, etc.
I see. You know, obviously, your family experienced the most extreme forms of anti-Semitism in Europe. But you lived in many places since then. You've immigrated many places since then. And I'm wondering how, if you've experienced anti-Semitism in the Philippines, having so few Jews living there in the first place, or in the United States when you came here.
No, I was very fortunate. I had never had any problems experiencing any anti-Semitism here or after I left Germany completely.
And we had a question from Julia Ban. Having lived through the horror of the Holocaust, what do you think of what happened on January 6th in Washington, D.C.? And I know that, you know, the siege on the Capitol, we had actually spoken on the phone very soon afterwards. So if you wanted to share anything at all about your feelings.
Well, you know, my idea is that in the last 4 years, this country was living under a lot of lies and subjected to lies by the leadership. And this really caused a terrible division among the democratic institutions in this country. And all my friends who are from that period, we always discussed saying, this looks like Germany to us. It's terrible what's happening. And we should be very, very careful, and we should be very, very aware what is happening. My wife even asked, where are we going to go if something like this happened? And I said, let's go back to Germany. You know, because even though they have Nazism there still, at least there are laws against it. And this is not the case in America, where you have right to speak anything you want. And if you get a following, that's it.
And as you were speaking, we've also been having comments and questions, and Ellen Lang is asking, what is your advice to us about how to deal with the recent shift you just described? What steps can we take? Do you have any thoughts or viewpoints on that?
We always have to talk up. We cannot stay silent. That's the only thing to do. Get your senators, your representatives alerted to your worries and force them to do something about it. If they don't want to do it, agitate for it in your community. But you have to speak up. You cannot stay silent. And that's what, unfortunately, the Germans did in Germany. They stayed silent, and the thing just went on and on.
And, you know, to that point, it's a big reason why at our Holocaust Center, we focus so much of our time and our attention in working with students on being upstanders, right? And not being a bystander and doing the right thing, right?
Exactly.
And as you were talking about making sure that our representatives know where we stand and listen to us, I also did want to point out that in the chat, we have Representative Anna Viescamani, and she said, well said. She's been here listening to the program and said, we have a lot of work to do in America against anti-Semitism and anti-racism.
Right.
So even your talk today, I think, is really speaking to many people and hopefully inspiring them to be upstanders themselves.
It was a real privilege talking to you all. Thank you so much.
Was there anything else that you wanted to say, or any last comments? That we actually have a lot of students on the call as well. If there's anything that you wanted to end with before we move on to the conclusion of our program.
My suggestion to students is be inquisitive, study history, make sure that you understand what can happen if you let it happen, and act up. You're in a democratic country and you are able to act. You won't be taken away by the police the next day, as they do in Russia, as they do in China. The Chinese may be good at cutting down on the number of deaths they had on the COVID-19, but look at the way they did it. And we don't do it that way. So we're suffering more. We could have been organized better, like the Koreans were organized, and they have much fewer deaths than we in America. But anyway, the thing to do is to act and to speak up and learn to do that and learn from history. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ralph. And Kimberly Harshman just said, well said, we must speak out against injustice. From Pamela Cantor, thank you, Ralph, for inspiring us to stand up and speak out.
Thank you.
And I wanted to encourage anyone that hasn't already seen the film, Rescue in the Philippines, and also thank you to Barbara Sasser, one of the producers on the film, is actually on the call as well, watching Ralph. She wanted to make sure to be here to support you and to hear your story. But if you haven't already seen it, please know that you do have a couple days left. All you need to do is go to our website, which is holocaustedu.org. We'll put the link in the chat box for you. You can RSVP, will send you a link as well as a password to watch the film, and that'll be good through till January 27th, which actually January 27th is the actual International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We're a couple days early in doing programming for it. And so we're very lucky and privileged to be able to hear such amazing stories, and especially from Ralph personally, of struggle, but ultimately survival and success and happiness. But we all know that for too many, that was not the case, right? And so we want to make sure it's imperative that we remember those that were not so lucky and that perished during the Holocaust. And so at this time, before we conclude, I'd like to invite Rabbi Kay to join us in leading us in reciting the Mourner's Kaddish.
To everyone, and a special thanks to Ralph for really just a profoundly moving and very educational presentation, that your family not only had to escape once from Germany and the Nazis, but also had to hide from the Japanese in the Philippines as well. Really, really remarkable story, something that we should all be very, very thankful to be able to hear and that we should learn from and put into our daily lives. Kaddish Yatom is called the Orphans Kaddish, usually referred to as the Mourner's Kaddish. This is the traditional prayer recited in Jewish communities for those who have passed away. A couple of unique things about the text of this prayer. One is that it is in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. This is the language that the Talmud is written in. And so it comes to us from a period in Jewish history where there was tremendous oppression of the Jewish community in the land of Israel and outside as well. So it sort of has its origins in another period of great distress in Jewish history. It does not mention God by God's proper names, refers to God by pronouns, but not actually using any of God's proper names. Likewise, even though it is recited as a memorial prayer, it doesn't refer to death. It's a doxology. It's a listing of praises for God, but really it's an acknowledgement that no matter how grateful we are and how much praise we offer, it's never going to be enough. And for a memorial prayer, that's a little bit odd, but if we give it a little deeper thought, it actually makes very good sense, because it means that we are acknowledging there are things beyond our control, there are things beyond our understanding, and yet we still have the obligation to engage in what life gives us and to continue to persevere to the best of our abilities. I invite those who would like to do so to join me in the recitation of Kaddish Yatom, the traditional memorial prayer for those souls who have passed on or have been taken from us. Yitkadal v'yitkadash me'raba, be'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute, v'chayichon v'yomechon uv'chaye d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'izman kariv v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shmei rabba mevarach la'alam alamei amaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shmei d'kusha v'chul eila min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata da'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shlama rabba min shmaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Going to turn the program now back to Rachel Lucy.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Kay. At this time, I just wanted, on behalf of the entire Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida, I want to thank you all for coming today for this commemoration. And of course, a special thanks to our students that joined us earlier, for Ralph and sharing that beautiful and lesser known narrative with us. And of course, Keith and Jacqueline that were also helping with this program as well. Please know that anyone attending today, you will be receiving an email from us with information on the recording of this program, if anyone would like to view it again or share with others that weren't able to make it today. The information for that will be in the email, of course, along with a link to a survey to help us in providing the best programming and meeting the needs of our community. So please, if you could take a moment just to fill that out for us, we would greatly appreciate it. Some other upcoming events, we tried to do as much in sharing stories of survivors and family members as possible. And so our next In My Own Words will actually be February 7th, and we'll be having, this is a mother-daughter sharing, and that will be with Bernice Lerner and Ruth Mermelstein, as well as later on in the month, we'll be continuing on our Strategies for Action series on February 17th. This one's entitled Facing Uncomfortable Truths, and that will be with a human rights activist, Richard Lapchick. So on behalf of the Holocaust Center, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I hope you have a wonderful evening and rest of your weekend. Thank you for joining us.